Hi, family. Welcome to the channel. If you love deep emotional stories that hit close to home, you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join our community of story lovers. We drop powerful tales every single week that'll make you think, feel, and maybe even heal. Quick story. Highlight, Ashes and Bloom. Today's story follows Seraphina Knox, a devoted woman who gave everything, her money, her time, her dreams for the man she loved. But when he hit the jackpot, he left her behind like yesterday's news. What he didn't expect was that the very document he laughed at years ago would turn the tables completely. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and sweet justice, the kind you don't need to scream about to feel. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever sacrificed so much for someone that you lost yourself? Do you believe people show their true colors when money comes into the picture? And if someone betrayed you after everything you gave, would you fight back or walk away in silence? Grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into Ashes and Bloom, a story that proves sometimes the quietest women carry the sharpest power. And don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a story that speaks to the soul. Let's begin. In the blazing haze of July 2004, on the noisy, sunburnt streets of Lagos Island, Seraphina Knox met Cassian for the first time. Seraphina, 26, was barely keeping herself together as a care assistant at a rundown clinic in Surulere. Her world revolved around bedpans, fading heartbeats, and prayer warriors at the edge of hospital beds. She worked nights, slept in fragments, and sent every extra naira to support her younger brother Sterling's law school dreams. Her life was sacrifice on repeat, stitched together with devotion and just enough hope to keep going. Cassian, meanwhile, wore his sweat like armor. He worked security at an Apapa shipping yard, spending his nights pacing docks thick with diesel smoke and promises. But his mouth was full of plans, real ones. He dreamed of a fleet of haulage trucks with his name on the side, and he talked about pulling his mother out of her corrugated shack in Makoko. Seraphina had met men who bragged before, but Cassian worked while he talked. She respected that. He wasn't rich, but he was rich in drive. Their romance started not with roses, but with roasted corn and chilled malt drinks. Cassian would meet her outside her flat at the end of her night shift, offering small comforts and listening like he had nowhere else to be. No gifts, no candlelit dinners, just two exhausted people finding sanctuary in each other. She never imagined she'd share her space with someone again, but Cassian made room for laughter in a place that had long forgotten it. On the creaking steps of her compound, under the hum of faulty power lines, something real took root between them, quiet, resilient, and entirely their own. By 2006, life had become a balancing act of desperation and grit. Cassian lost his job when the port company downsized, another victim of corporate restructuring. Seraphina didn't panic. She picked up more shifts at the hospital, added weekend cleaning gigs in Lekki Phase 1, and started weaving wigs from her small one-room apartment in Machin. Her days were a blur of antiseptic smells, sweat, and prayer, yet she held it all together with the quiet resolve of a woman who had never been allowed to fall apart. Cassian didn't loaf. He found odd jobs, dispatch runs, offloading goods in Mile 2, even briefly selling used phones at Computer Village. But his pay never matched his effort. Seraphina stretched every kobo like magic, and when Cassian told her he wanted to go back to school and earn a certificate in supply chain management, she didn't hesitate. She took out a personal loan under her name. The interest was merciless, but she believed in his dream more than he did. "If you win, we both win," she told him, slipping the receipt for his tuition between the pages of his study notebook. Things got heavier. Cassian's teenage son, Xavier, came to live with them for a semester. Seraphina paid for school uniforms, textbooks, and new shoes without complaint. When Cassian's mother fell sick and had to move in, Seraphina adjusted, gave up her bed, slept on a mat, and nursed the old woman through sleepless nights. Her life became a revolving door of sacrifice, but she never asked for thanks. She just pressed on, cooking cassava, applying menthol rubs, organizing medication. People said she was too soft. What they didn't see was the steel underneath, quiet, firm, unbreakable. On a dusty Thursday morning in October, Seraphina and Cassian married in a low-key civil ceremony at the Ikoyi registry. No white dress, no orchestra, just a few close friends and her brother Sterling as witness. After they exchanged vows, Seraphina pulled out a folded sheet of paper, handwritten and notarized. A prenup. If Cassian ever came into big money during their marriage and walked away, Seraphina would receive it all. Cassian laughed and signed. "If I ever get rich, it'll be because you made it possible," he said, kissing her forehead. By 2011, it seemed like the tide had finally begun to shift. Cassian had finished his diploma and landed a steady job as an operations supervisor for a warehouse in Ikeja. It wasn't his dream empire, but it was reliable income, and for the first time in years, Seraphina allowed herself to hope. They could afford more than just survival, maybe a short trip to Ibadan, or furniture that didn't creak. The future was still humble, but it was theirs, shaped by sweat and sacrifice. Cassian's confidence began to swell. He walked straighter, talked louder, stayed out later. He began meeting business contacts after work, people Seraphina never met, men with thick accents and fast cars. At first, she was proud. She packed his lunch, ironed his shirts, and stayed up to hear about his meetings. But slowly, he stopped sharing details. "You wouldn't understand logistics," he'd say, brushing off her questions with a half smile. Seraphina didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence keeps the peace better than truth. Still, the weight of everything fell on her. Xavier, now a teenager, needed transport fare for school, data bundles for classes, and later, money for jam forms. Cassian's mother's health declined further. Seraphina became the caretaker, financier, and emotional glue all over again. She ran the household while Cassian poured himself into late nights and business plans she never saw. Sometimes, lying in the dark with a body that refused to relax, Seraphina thought about the dreams she had shelved: owning a book cafe, learning to swim, taking herself on a retreat to Obudu. But every time she got close to those thoughts, she'd shut them down. She told herself, "We're a team. I chose this, and one day, it'll be worth it." But deep down, Seraphina had started to feel it, the erosion. Love was still there, but it was no longer the kind that made her feel full. It had become something else, a duty, a promise she wasn't sure had been returned. The day everything changed was ordinary in every way. Seraphina had worked a double shift at the clinic, 2 births, 1 funeral, and a spilled tray of medication that nearly pushed her to tears. Cassian had called earlier, saying he'd be late due to one small run after work. She didn't ask questions anymore. When she finally dragged herself up the stairs to their flat in Yaba, her feet swollen and mind fogged, she found him already waiting outside the door. His face was lit up like the Lagos skyline after Nipa returned. "Baby, we made it," he shouted, waving a piece of paper with such wild energy she thought he was joking until he held it out. A scratch card, a winning ticket, 3.2 billion naira. Cassian had bought it from a petrol station kiosk on his way home. Seraphina didn't speak. Her knees buckled. He caught her, and they laughed wild, breathless laughter that tasted like relief and disbelief all at once. They drove to the Lagos Lottery Authority the next day, hearts thumping like drums during Harmadan. And it was real. A cash option payout over 1.6 billion naira after taxes and fees. For the first time in her life, Seraphina let herself imagine more than just survival. A quiet house near the water in EPE. Time to read again. Maybe even go back to school. Cassian talked of bigger things. A new business, relocating to Dubai, retiring his mother for good. They started scrolling through property listings and YouTube tours of mansions in Banana Island. But something subtle shifted in Cassian. He spoke faster now, smiled less at Seraphina, and more at his buzzing phone. Old friends suddenly returned, men with gold chains and flashy talk, women Seraphina had never heard of. She tried not to panic. This was new territory after all. Money brought noise. But late at night, while Cassian laughed on the phone in the living room, Seraphina stared at the ceiling and gripped her chest, already mourning a version of him that seemed to be fading. The weeks that followed were loud. Cassian didn't just celebrate, he erupted. New cars arrived at the compound, 1 a month. A jet black Range Rover with tinted windows. Then a red Lexus he said was for errands. He threw parties that choked their once quiet street with music, perfumes, and strangers. Seraphina tried to keep up, wore her finest ankara, greeted guests, cleaned up when the drinks ran dry, but she felt more like staff than wife. Cassian had changed, and not in the way she'd expected. He stopped checking in. Sometimes he'd disappear for days saying he was in Abuja for business. Other times he'd come home at dawn, cologne lingering, eyes unfocused. Seraphina confronted him once, gently. "Shouldn't we sit down and plan? The money could go quickly if we don't." Cassian cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Must you always talk like we're broke? Relax, Sarah. This is our blessing. Let me enjoy it." She said nothing, but her heart thudded as she recalled a memory buried in the pages of time, a folded sheet of paper, tucked away in her old handbag, yellowed and creased, the prenup. They'd signed it on a humid afternoon in 2008. Cassian hadn't even read it properly. "If I ever make it big, you'll be the reason," he had said. "And if I ever leave, I'll still leave you taken care of." But now Seraphina saw no sign of that man. Cassian was drenched in designer labels, dripping with swagger. His humility evaporated. Women she didn't know started calling the house. A woman in towering heels and a fake British accent once answered Cassian's phone when Seraphina called him late at night. "He's busy, darling," the woman said, then hung up. The final blow came quietly. Seraphina returned home one evening after a long shift at the hospital, her final one before she planned to resign, and found her clothes stuffed into black nylon bags on the front porch. The locks had been changed. Inside, laughter rang from the living room. Cassian was on the couch with another woman, drinking champagne. "You don't live here anymore," he said flatly, not even meeting her eyes. "It's over. Papers are coming." Seraphina didn't cry at first. She stood there on the porch, her life condensed into trash bags and humiliation, while Cassian popped another bottle of champagne inside. The woman beside him smirked, crossed her legs, and turned up the volume on the Bluetooth speaker. Seraphina thought she might scream, or faint, or burst into flames. But instead, she picked up her bags, one by one, and walked away. The city swallowed her like an unkind ocean. She stayed with her cousin Bellamy in a hodu for 2 weeks, sleeping on a mattress beside the window, listening to mosquitoes buzz like demons in the dark. She couldn't eat, couldn't think. She replayed every moment, every shift she'd worked for Cassian's tuition. Every night she'd massaged his mother's legs, every piece of herself she'd handed over like a gift. And for what? Eviction by laughter. Silence by betrayal. The pitying looks from neighbors. The sudden absence of calls from friends who used to visit when the pot was full. The divorce papers came in a white envelope sealed with indifference. A court bailiff delivered them to Bellamy's gate. Seraphina barely opened it. There was no apology, no explanation, just a statement of property Cassian claimed was his. He offered her nothing, not a car, not a coin. And still, Seraphina didn't weep. She felt nothing but a hollow ache, like her body had been scooped out. Then came a phone call from her brother Sterling, the only person who had ever seen all the things she'd buried beneath duty. "Sarah," he said gently, "didn't you two sign something back then? At the wedding? The prenup?" The memory hit her like a drum. The paper, the signature, the line that said if Cassian ever came into wealth during the marriage and left her, everything would be hers. She tore through her duffel bag like a woman possessed and found it. Wrinkled, dusty, still smelling faintly of biro ink and heartbreak. It was all there. Seraphina stared at the document long into the night. The lines were unmistakable, written in her brother Sterling's square handwriting, signed by both parties, and notarized by a street-side legal clerk in Mushin who had charged them 5,000 naira and a bottle of malt. It was clear. If Cassian Doyle comes into significant personal wealth during the course of his marriage to Seraphina Knox, and said marriage is legally dissolved, Seraphina Knox shall be entitled to the full sum of said wealth, regardless of how it was obtained. It had sounded like a joke, then Cassian had even laughed. "If I ever get rich, it'll be because of you. If I ever leave, you'll never suffer." But now he was rich, and now he had left. Seraphina found a lawyer through a friend of her brother's, a sharp, quiet woman named Isla Trent, who operated out of a modest office in Cerulari and took the case on contingency. After one look at the prenup, Isla leaned back in her chair and said, "This is ironclad. He's in trouble." Cassian, as expected, laughed when he was served. "Tell your client to relax," his lawyer scoffed. "There is no way a paper written with biro can hold in court." But when the document was examined, validated, and presented to the High Court in Lagos, the judge barely needed a recess. The wording was clean, the signatures authentic, the intention crystal clear. Cassian began to panic when the proceedings moved swiftly. He tried to delay offering Seraphina a settlement, a car, even a property in Ibejuleki. She refused. She wasn't after revenge. She was after restoration. He had forgotten the years she fed his child, buried her dreams, and sold her father's farmland for his education. But the law had not. When the ruling came, it was final. The full sum of Cassian Doyle's lottery winnings, assets acquired with said funds, and any profits derived therefrom were to be transferred to Seraphina Knox within 30 days. That night, Seraphina sat on her cousin's bed with her phone in her hand staring at the bank app. The balance blinked back at her, 1.6 billion naira. She didn't scream, didn't dance, she just exhaled. Not with joy, with release. She was no longer surviving someone else's story. She was writing her own. Seraphina didn't make a single post. No cryptic captions, no long threads, no carefully curated photos flaunting her new wealth. The money had hit her account like a whisper, and she received it the same way, with stillness. While the world spun with gossip and noise, Seraphina slipped out of Lagos before dawn, no fanfare, no goodbyes. She boarded a bus to Savarin, a sleepy coastal town tucked along Nigeria's southeast edge, known more for its quiet beaches than its luxury. She bought a modest sun-washed bungalow surrounded by overgrown hibiscus and a mango tree that leaned toward the back porch. The house came with uneven floor tiles, rusted taps, and a garden that hadn't seen care in years. But it was hers, paid in full. No landlord, no shared walls, no one's name on the deed but her own. She spent her first 2 weeks cleaning, scrubbing her past out of her bones, letting the air fill the spaces in her chest where grief used to live. She started a garden, slowly, tomatoes, peppers, efo leaves, and okra. The first time her hands sank into the soil, Seraphina cried. Not loudly, just a steady leak of tears that soaked into the earth like rain. For the first time in decades, she was not working for survival. She wasn't fixing anyone else's life. She was growing her own. She paid back every single person who had once helped her quietly, without notes or speeches. She gave to the hospital in Surulere under a different name. She tithed to a small church where the pews were cracked, but the prayers were honest. The money gave her freedom, yes, but the real wealth came in the silence, the soft mornings, the lack of dread. No ringing phones, no insults, no footsteps that made her brace for argument. Seraphina walked barefoot through her home each evening, brewed zobo from dried hibiscus petals, and listened to high-life music on the radio. She had lost love, family, and pieces of herself. But now, finally, she had peace. And it was worth more than all the millions. Cassian Doyle didn't feel the fall at first. He was still riding high off champagne and attention, lounging in rented luxury apartments on Victoria Island, flanked by people who only knew his name because it echoed against marble walls. The day he received the court order transferring everything to Seraphina, he laughed. "Appeal it," he told his lawyer. "She won't last long with it." But the ruling held. His accounts were frozen, assets seized, the cars, the watches, even the house he had kicked Seraphina out of, all vanished like a mirage under harsh sun. His new circle evaporated faster than fuel in a generator tank. The woman who had sat beside him the night he tossed Seraphina out left him within a week of the verdict. She took his last gold chain with her. Friends stopped returning calls. Party invitations dried up. And when he tried to crash an art gala hosted by someone he once hooked up with on a deal, security asked him politely but firmly to leave. Twice. Within 2 months, Cassian was living in a cramped one-room boys' quarter behind his mother's church in Makoko. The mattress was too short for his long legs, and the fan never rotated. His mother spoke only when necessary. "What did I warn you?" she said once, stirring a pot of ogbono. "The woman who suffers with you is the one heaven watches." He tried to get work again, he really did, but his name had become a punchline. "Mr. Billions turned beggar," the memes read. Even his own son, Xavier, now working at a startup in Abuja, stopped picking up his calls. "Don't drag me into this mess," he texted once. Cassian thought about reaching out to Seraphina. He even wrote a message one night. "I'm sorry, truly. Please, can we talk?" But he deleted it before sending. He knew the kind of woman she was. She wouldn't rage. She wouldn't gloat. She would simply move on, and she had. One evening, as he sat outside under a patched umbrella, rain leaking through the edges, a former neighbor called him. Just one line. "You know she's living good, right? Quiet. Happy. I hear she's planting tomatoes." Cassian said nothing. He just nodded slowly, the laughter drained from him, as the sound of his own undoing rang louder than any music he'd ever played. The garden had grown wild with color. Cassava leaves danced in the breeze. Tomatoes clung to their vines like tiny jewels. Seraphina Knox stood barefoot in the early morning light, wearing an old wrapper and holding a cup of lemongrass tea, steam curling gently into the coastal air. Birds sang from the rooftop. The sun was just beginning to warm the red earth. It had been over a year since the ruling. She hadn't told many people. Her brother Sterling knew, of course, a handful of close friends she still trusted. But Seraphina never flaunted her victory. She never needed to. Her wealth now lived in time. Time to rest, to reflect, to walk without rush. She took pottery classes at a small workshop in town, read novels again. Sometimes she took long drives to neighboring villages, buying fresh produce and chatting with roadside vendors like an ordinary woman. People whispered, of course. The woman who got all the money, the one the man threw out, and now she owns everything. She heard them. She just smiled. The truth didn't live in gossip. It lived in the way her body no longer tensed at night, in the way her laughter returned without being pulled from her like a burden. Cassian never contacted her again. She once saw a blurry photo of him on social media, shared in a post mocking fallen ballers. He looked thin, tired, like a man who had walked too far in the wrong direction. Seraphina didn't feel triumph. She felt nothing. Not anger, not vengeance, just peace. He had made his choice. She had made hers. Sometimes in the cool of the evening, she would sit on her porch and write. Not for anyone, just to remember. She wrote about love and loss, about women who carry too much and still survive, about healing that doesn't come with fire, but with time and water and soil, about a woman who gave until she had nothing left and then gave to herself. Seraphina Knox didn't need anyone to clap for her. Her life was her applause. The garden, the wind, the silence, each one whispered, "You made it, on your own, and that is enough." The end. What are your thoughts on Ashes in Bloom? Did Seraphina make the right choices? What lessons did you take from her journey? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful tale of resilience, love, and redemption. And remember, sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful.